We're extremely fortunate to have these distinguished scholars here today who are going to offer us some insight on where Dehn fits in the greater scheme of things, and we're going to talk a little bit about why mid-century masters matter. So I'm going to hand it over to Philip and Henry and let them give us some insights. I think Henry's going to start.
Yeah, let me just say a few words of introduction, because I think that Philip is one of a very major figure in American art history who's really never received fully the attention he deserves. And I've also worked on American art of the 1930s. I worked on Thomas Hart Benton, and not so long ago that was sort of like announcing that you were a vampire. People would take 3 steps back when you announced that you had worked on one of these realist painters of the 1930s. I first learned of Philip's work because he worked on Paul Cadmus, who set a kind of record for the 1930s. He had I think 7 paintings that were stirred up controversy and were taken off view, or murals that were removed from post offices or things like that. And this was an extraordinary book for the period. It's the kind of thing where you pull the covers over your head at night and you read it with a flashlight. Cadmus was both the realist and he also was a gay artist. And Philip pulled together an extraordinary show of Paul Cadmus's work, which the Whitney Museum declined, and instead it was shown at Miami University in Ohio. But it's a kind of, it's almost like an underground comic book for an art historian. This was really a breakthrough piece of scholarship. He's also worked on Robert Victory, Henry Kerner, Colleen Browning, Stephen Dohanas, a contemporary realist, Robert Jackson. And now he's working on, he's produced this book on Adolf Dehn, who was a major printmaker and watercolorist of the 1930s and whose work was represented in 50 major museums in Europe and the United States by the time of his death, including places like the British Museum and the Rijksprinten Cabinet in Amsterdam. Dehn was a major figure in lithography. He basically transformed lithography from something where you draw with the crayon to something where you use sandpaper, you use scraping, you use a razor blade, you use something called touche, which is a liquid ink, so that he basically transformed lithography from being something similar to an academic drawing to being as rich in its effects as a painting. He also was a remarkable watercolorist who did similar technical innovations using very wet paper, mixing watercolor and opaque pigment. Lloyd Goodrich ranked Dehn as one of the 6 major figures in American watercolor, along with figures like Winslow Homer and Sargent and John Marin and Charles Demuth. Much of Dehn's work is very sophisticated in its subject matter, and it's something of a surprise to learn that he was born in Minnesota. He was the son of a fisherman and trapper and of sod-busting pioneers who had literally come to Minnesota in a covered wagon. And as a child, Dehn grew up with mink, beaver, and skunk skins being stretched in his bedroom by his father. He went on to an early career in New York, then had a period in Europe where he did cafe scenes and was associated with The Dial, which was the leading avant-garde magazine of that period. The Dial was the place that first published T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. And then in the 1930s, he returned to the United States and did work that was, picked up watercolor and did work that fit with the American scene period of art of that period. Philip, as usual, has come up with an original interpretation, and he's followed a clue that in a sense was so obvious that it's amazing that no one else had ever pursued this watercolor by Dehn in the Metropolitan Museum is one of the most widely reproduced works in the museum, except that nobody knows who did it. And it's probably more reproduced than major paintings by people like Rubens and El Greco and Rembrandt, who are, have a bigger place in the history of art. And I think Philip realized that this was a case where the history of art needs to catch up with what's going on. So I'll let Philip talk about that in a moment, but what's interesting is that Dehn captured something about New York City that no other figure captured to quite the same degree, and he really caught New York at the moment when New York became the world's leading city, the world's leading cultural center, which it had not been even a generation before. With that effusive introduction, I should note that Philip is probably not the most talented person in his family. That was probably his grandmother, who was an artist who studied with Charles Hassan. Philip also surprisingly was at the Woodstock Festival, and I understand that if you watch closely the movie of all those naked people in the pond, that he's
Absolutely.
one of them.
The Hieronymus Bosch scene.
And just to close this out, I'd like to say that I think we all owe a great debt to Andy Lowe and Ginny Connors, who are basically Virginia Dehn's niece and nephew. If you work on art history projects, it's amazing how artists, widows, artists' children can really be a pain in the neck and can also really destroy an artist's reputation by being so it's sort of tyrannical and idiotic in how they handle an artist's state. Andy and Ginny have been just absolutely exemplary. I think they've done a very good job from the business standpoint, and they've been wonderfully generous and honorable to deal with. So they're extraordinary people. And the final tribute, of course, is to Leslie Pell Van Breen of the Artist Book Foundation, doing great work. And I think this is an extraordinary book in terms of its visual design.
Thank you.
So,
Okay, thank you, Henry. I'm very aware of always of the being in this moment, being here, being at Mass MoCA. This is my first visit here, and I've heard about North Adams and the idea of look at what we're discussing today is this artist, Mr. Dehn, whose presence is very much with us, and you have to look at this in its totality. We're in this completely revitalized place where really the spirits of old industrial New England, of what was creativity in American art in the Industrial Revolution, the 19th century, and we're here in this moment, in this beautiful autumn afternoon in October, and I'm very aware of the sort of the whole sense of it. It's obvious we're in a place where this is one of the great temples of avant-garde contemporary art. This is the Vatican of avant-garde contemporary art in America. This extraordinary place, this Mass MoCA, and the fact that the way the pieces of this come together, and that Leslie and her team and TABF and what the Artist Book Foundation is doing is giving oxygen to sort of, there's a real sense of these people, their spirits are living again. They're here. These artists have not been forgotten. And I have to explain that if I would have thought that I would be doing the book launch of the Adolf Dehn book at Mass MoCA, if you'd have told me that 5 years ago, this is the type of thing. I was at a conference with Henry Adams. We were talking about another lost generation artist named Colleen Browning, and we did a book with Leslie on Colleen Browning, and we were way out in the wilds of Western Pennsylvania and in deer country in Western Pennsylvania, and we were talking about American art, and Henry said something like, we like these realist artists. You have to all understand we're not Philistines. We're not troglodytes. We really like, we understand contemporary art. We understand, yes, I teach contemporary painting. I teach contemporary art. And yet I have felt that my life work has been giving voice to these artists who have been essentially plowed under. And I'll talk about that. But I'm very aware of this all in sort of the tapestry of American art and of the voices of past. And when I met Andy Lowe and Andy and Andrea, who I sat in her kitchen too many times, and she was so kind giving me, making sure I had everything. But I was sort of trying to sort this out, and I was so aware of nobody knew who Adolf Dehn was. I mean, Adolf Dehn was a name that I mentioned this to members of the family. With the exception of professional art critics and a few art dealers around the country, you would mention the name Adolf Dehn, and I don't think 300 people in the country would know who the name Adolf Dehn was. Then to imagine that, the vision of this project and bringing Dehn back. But listen, here's just a kind of invocation of the voices of the past. Here's somebody who's a voice for that world that Adolf Dehn was part of. This is some of you might know this. I am with you. I am with you, you men and women of a generation, or ever so many generations hence. What is it then between us? What is the count of the scores of hundreds of years between us? I too walked the streets of Manhattan Island, bathed in the waters around it, stand up, tall mast of Mannahatta. Mannahatta was the Lenape Indians. They were known as the Mannahatta. Thrive, cities, bring your freight, bring your shows. We fathom you not, we love you. There is perfection in you also. That was written in 1856 by Walt Whitman in the Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. And whether it's Whitman in old New York, old Dutch New York, or Whitman or Dehn with his crayon sitting under the Brooklyn Bridge, or looking out from the Staten Island Ferry, this is all, there's something really very, very spiritual and magical about that. We're able to bring the spirit of this man, this important artist, back into the work we're doing. Let me offer a chronology. I met Andy Lowe over 3 years ago, and we spoke. And actually, no, Andy, I had met you earlier, many years earlier. In fact, we'd met in Southport, Connecticut, and I had known that he was had just taken on this project of the Dehn estate, and then we focused on this idea of this book project, and you have to understand that my colleague Henry Adams had been working on this idea of a large monograph, and Henry, talking about generosity, in a very collegial way, he had been far down the road. He's working on a much larger biography of Dehn. And in a very generous way, I said, look, could I see how far you are in the state of your research? And that's the type of generosity that happens only amongst colleagues who really have a sense of trust, that we shared in the objective of trying to bring this material forward. So I had known the outlines of it. And as I approached this project, I wanted to get down to the brass tacks. How and why did Dehn's career, how did it sail? What were the conditions, the social, cultural conditions in America? In my text, when you read this, you'll see that there's a moment in time, and you almost cannot recreate this moment in time. I was showing someone earlier when we were, and that is, when you think about Adolf Dehn was featured in Life magazine in a big color spread, and the date of this, with Rita Hayworth on the cover, the date of this is August 11, 1941. This is 5 months before Pearl Harbor. And he was being triumphantly hailed as one of America's great regionalist artists, and yet he was a regionalist, and yet he was working in Manhattan. He had been a social satirist. I mean, it was hard to put Dehn into one category. He was truly all over the place. And then, of course, what happened is that as if the war puts a pause to what American regionalism, the Paint America movement out of the New Deal, the movement that Henry was really the first of our generation of art historians. Henry was really the one who did the excavation. He did he was like the bones. He was digging up, and almost bringing the bones of one of the greatest painters, Thomas Hart Benton, to the surface. No one in the 1970s was interested in Thomas Hart Benton. And there was this fellow named Henry Adams who said, no, this is very important. The most important art critic in New York City at that time, who lorded over the New York Times art page, was Hilton Kramer. And Hilton Kramer wrote a review of a Thomas Hart Benton show, and this was in the 80s, and he said, this is positively the worst exhibit of art shown in New York in a generation. I mean, it was something just complete, like, this was completely boulderized. This was art that had no value. It was just sort of 30s propaganda. There was always this uncomfortable mixture, because when you have to walk this back. Why did so many of these social realist and scene painters and academic artists like Dehn and his colleagues, why were they met with such suspicion and outright dismissal in the generation of the art criticism of the 60s and 70s and into the 80s? Well, you have to remember this, that in fact this was really the afterburn of totalitarian, fascist art of the art program of the Third Reich, the art program of Mussolini's Italy, the art program of the Soviet Academy, which was completely these kind of mindless, paintings of these beautiful idealized nudes that Adolf Ziegler and some of these painters were painting. And so for the generation of critics, sort of completely entrenched in the New York intelligentsia. We're talking about the reading in the New York Review of Books, the art reading in the Art News, reading in the art literature of the 40s and 50s. This type of art was an anathema. This was just radioactive. I mean, because it became guilt by association. This art was considered to be so tainted because it looked Stalinist. It looked like mindless peasants out in the kulaks, out in the Ukraine, harvesting wheat. No, it was Lloyd Goodrich talking about Adolf Dehn's watercolors out in Minnesota. But there was this guilt by association. And you have to understand that when Henry was, I think his hair was a little darker then, when he was a young guy, he was writing about Thomas Hart Benton. You would always want to have a quote in your paper or in your graduate paper. You'd always wanted to make sure that Henry Adams was in your footnotes, because he was breaking ground of how we're going to, we're just not going to be, we're not going to be cool. We're not going to be worried about all kinds of derogatory comments from our colleagues. We're going to just look at this art and its value. Triumphantly, if you've been back at the Metropolitan Museum in the last 4 or 5 years, the America Today murals, the Thomas Hart Benton murals, are probably the greatest thing you have in the whole 20th century wing. I mean, they're just breathtaking. I realize this from my students, because I tell them, write about pick one painting in the 20th century wing, and half my students want to write about Thomas Hart Benton, because of the way he communicates. So this is all part of a story of how a group of art historians, scholars in a generation, we knew that we were coming, we were looking at the triumph of the American school, the triumph of American painting, abstract painting, which is absolutely, we are not Philistines, we are not troglodytes. I I'm happy to teach Pollock and Rothko and Frankenthaler and Newman and Gottlieb. These are very important artists. I happen to like looking at these paintings more. The issue of taste is something I never resist the idea of the major shift, the cultural shift of what happened. When you look at this book, you'll see there's a little graph, and sometimes cartoons in the most innocent ways. There's a little graph written by one of the prominent artists of this period was a fellow named Ad Reinhardt. He was a very important abstract painter, and he did these black paintings, and they were sort of the void. They're darker than Rothko in terms of the void, the emptiness of them. And he does this very clever cartoon, very clever, for a magazine in 1946, which is called How to Look at Modern American Art in America. And you'll have to look at this and use your magnifying glass. But there's the tree that is growing, of course, all of the new artists that are emerging after Hiroshima in the wake of the nuclear blast, from Auschwitz to Hiroshima. The new artists are all, of course, Rothko and Pollock and de Kooning and the whole New York school. And then there's a cornfield down here. It's a cemetery. It's a graveyard. And in this graveyard are the artists Grant Wood, Thomas Hart Benton, Paul Cadmus, who I was Mr. Cadmus's biographer, and falling off one of the bottom, like an autumn leaf today in the Berkshires, about to drop off the tree, is Adolf Dehn. So these people are headed for the cemetery of American art. These people are in the graveyard. So being, grave digger in excavating the careers of American artists has been a mission, and one that has been, wonderful and rewarding for my work. I'll just say that more and more people are now. We've lived long enough, and our writing has been in print long enough that people understand.
This is very appropriate for Halloween, I have to say. Skeletons.
We're digging up these skeletons, and it's been very rewarding for me, because I always wanted to just paint. I always wanted to write about the artists that I felt spoke to me of that generation. I'll share with you one footnote, and then I'm going to go back to Henry. This comment that all writing is autobiographical. It doesn't matter if you're writing mystery novels or spy novels, or you're John Le Carré writing, did anyone see that on 60 Minutes a couple of weeks ago? John Le Carré was, all writing is autobiographical. And here's a moment that when you hear about scholars and Eureka and one of these almost cosmic moments you cannot quite imagine. So I'm deep into my chapter on the 1930s, and very, war resister, Adolf Dehn, World War I draft, conscientious objector, ends the war with an honorary discharge, and absolutely of the John Reed. This is Red October. This is the 100th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. This is Red October, the 100th anniversary this month. And he was and socialist, bred with Christian socialist in Minnesota. Adolf Dehn is in Europe in the 20s, and he's a complete fellow traveler with the socialists, the publication, the Masses, which is the premier socialist magazine, which the U.S. Postal Service had to stop for being subversive. And there is now a meeting to protest fascism after Franco is involved in Spain in 1936, and there's a meeting at the New School Auditorium in Manhattan, and there's a list of the 300 prominent members of everyone from the political wing and the art wing of the American Communist Party to socialists and artists and fellow travelers, and even people like Edward Hopper was there. I mean, it was just a very interesting melange of people. We have the names of the 300 men and women at this meeting to protest fascism in Franco's Spain, And I'm scrolling through a report on who is registered for this, and I see, Adolf Dehn, D, and I'm scrolling, and then I see my grandmother is the next name, Paula Eliasoph. So this idea that my grandmother, who was, as Henry said, my grandmother, do you have that postcard I gave you? My grandmother, who I gave Henry a postcard. Oh, here's my grandmother, who had been an impressionist painter in New York in the 20s and 30s, and worked very closely with Charles Hassan. I have this whole idea. My grandmother might have been sitting next to Adolf Dehn, and I'm here writing about it 75 years later. That's my moment. That's the serendipity. That's the magic when the scholarship becomes something that it is not only autobiographical, but you realize there's some higher meaning to why I'm writing this book and why I'm doing this. Henry.
So I think we're ready for questions, and also for those questions where you're telling us what to think. So who wants to fire away? It's sort of like the 39 steps. This is Mr. Memory.
I just wanted to say I like Tom Stark better in the 70s.
You have good taste.
I did.
You're one of the elect, I think. Because literally, one review of the Benton show compared him to the Antichrist, and then there was the one that said it was the worst exhibition he'd seen in 40 years, which I took as kind of a compliment, because that takes creativity. That's not just ordinary bad. That's that's up there.
But that meant for 99% of the public reading those in that kind of imprimatur, that kind of lure, that voice of someone like a Hilton Kramer to say this is bad art, then the 95% who don't really have their own opinions about what is good art and what is bad art, they'll say, well, Benton is bad art, so we're not going to consider it.
And I guess I'd say that for me, one of the fascinations of the 1930s is that in the period when realism was dismissed, there was the notion that all realism is exactly the same, and that realism is just real in some magical way. And what's fascinating about realism is what it has to do with kind of recreating the actual world in visual terms. And it's a kind of metaphysical act, I think. And every artist seems to do it differently. I think Dehn is a fascinating artist because his career is so varied. He's not an artist who's easy to reduce to a single image, although certainly this one on the cover of the book is a very popular image, but his work almost creates a narrative of a kind of journal or diary of his life where you see the changing experiences that he's going through.
Did that contribute to diminishing the standing? The fact that he didn't stay in any one?
Well, I think that Dehn...
This is your zealot comment, comment.
Well, in the introduction to what I've written about Dehn, I compare him to Zelig, the Woody Allen movie where he's always there, but you don't know quite who he is. He is a curiously ambiguous figure. You almost see, how would I say? Dehn's work has the quality of a detached observer in a peculiar way. And when you go through the narrative of his life, one of the things that's curious about it is that for each of the major phases of his career, there's a different girlfriend. And the girlfriends were all rather extraordinary figures. One of them was Wanda Gag, who became one of the most successful children books writer ever. Her book, Millions of Cats, is the oldest American children book that's been continuously in print since it was published. Then he married a Russian dancer. They got divorced. Then he had a girlfriend who was a photographer for Life magazine when he was a poet. And then, finally, Virginia Dane, who was quite a remarkable person. But where are we going with this? There is a kind of invisibility to Dane as in terms of what his own perspective is. He's always watching the foibles of humanity, but not himself coming out with a strong political or moral statement.
So Henry, I'm going to pose a question to you, okay?
Yeah.
Let me play. So in my approach, as I'm moving in on my target, on Dane, and I remember calling Andy and saying, I can't quite get away from this because I'm looking at this young man who was born in 1895 in a small town in southern Minnesota, Le Sueur County. Le Sueur, bird's eye peas from Le Sueur, that's southern Minnesota, with trapper and farming, hardy German ancestors. And I couldn't get over, and you can see here early in the introduction, the first pages of, here's young Dane, and all three of these American iconic heroes are of the same stock. Charles Lindbergh and Sinclair Lewis and F. Scott Fitzgerald, all out of Minnesota and all within 10 years of each other. In fact, later in life, Sinclair Lewis and Adolf Dehn met finally and spent time together in Manhattan. They had an idea they were going to write a book together, or he was going to write short stories about America, sort of travels with Charlie, and Adolf Dehn would do the drawings. The project never happened. But I'm looking at this as, this is American art coming out of the heartland at the turn of the century, and these, in science and aviation and literature, these are some of the giants of America. And so I guess the question I'm going to ask Professor Adams is, so what is the Americanness about Adolf Dehn? What is the, if you had to put your finger on the American quality of him with this coming out of the heartland?
Well, of course, one of the things that's curious about Dane is he spends the 20s in Europe and has this very sophisticated European style, and then in the 30s he goes back to a kind of American scene style, and then later in his career he develops another more modern style. I mean, I've always found America and Americanness a kind of elusive concept, because it seems to me it can mean different things, but Dane is certainly representative of the 20s generation in Paris, and in fact there's a marvelous sort of description of cafes in Paris by a writer named John Glasgow, which
Right.
describes an encounter between Dane and Leo Stein, the brother of Gertrude Stein. And, he's very much part of that sort of lost generation. Then he becomes, he fits nicely into the group of painters of the American scene. And I think in the 1950s and 1960s, he's, how would I say, he's part of that sensibility of the New Yorker and New Yorker covers and that kind of thing.
It's almost as though the 20s had this expression, this fluorescence of talent and writers coming from Minnesota and from Middle America, and then their experience of arriving in the big city. And another underlying motif that, again, weaving this in, and I guess autobiographically, is that I'm identifying in my text the experience of Adolf Dehn coming to New York on a scholarship to the Art Students League. It's the first time he'd ever been east, and it's almost exactly the way Nick Carraway in Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby has this this tension of the Middle West, and then Fitzgerald says the ragged edge of the universe, I decided to go east. And that was the spring of 22. I mean, that's amazing. Gatsby's published in 25. And just a few years earlier, Adolf Dehn was leaving Minnesota and coming east, just like Fitzgerald's character. You know, the interesting thing about The Great Gatsby, just as a sidebar, the book with the first edition was a complete flop. It sold 20,000 copies, and the book was a flop. And again, those are those hidden agendas of why an artist's work takes off and why some of it never gets the attention it deserves. Yes,
I just wanted to make a comment that
Tula.
sometimes being an outsider is very helpful in being able to watch things happen. And you're just usually amazed at the otherness. And so in a sense, it's like the eyes of an immigrant or an outsider just watching a world that's not familiar but exciting, and they live in it, but still from an outsider's point of view, so it's not as subjectively prejudiced because it's more objective and it's recording of everything going on. Even in Benton's work, even though he painted images of things he was familiar with, directly, there's a sense of neutrality of judgment and watching. And putting it all out there and accepting it and documenting it very much like a court reporter might. And I just wanted to say that I've been privileged to read Henry's various drafts of this book and parts of yours, and there's definitely, I believe, this powerful sense of large eyes looking.
Yeah.
And to, so much about immigration, and younger artists are very interested in artists who have documented and responded to the worlds that they've lived in. And so today this is very popular as opposed to the abstract painters who seem to be self-indulgent. And the eyes of younger artists who want to make narrative and, socially conscious work.
Yeah.
Speaking as an educator, this
Well, I think what is interesting is that we've learned that abstract painting, while it's fascinating in its way, is not the best vehicle for dealing with issues that have political content or that deal with issues of the body or gender or race or social justice. And, in a very understated way, I think a lot of Dane's work is dealing with that kind of issue. And also, of course, the other side. I mean, I think the cover of the book is wonderful. Isn't this the romance of New York City? He really captured it in some extraordinary way. And of course, what's fascinating about art, I think that both Dehn and Benton were aware of this, that in some unconscious way, the gesture of the hand in recording things is making judgments. And often it's capturing a quality of the time that's very particular. I think this is one of the things that's fascinating about Dane's work, the way he captured the quality of the different times he lived in.
What you choose to
Jenny.
observe or to capture indicates a judgment right there.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Could I suggest another way of looking at some of this work? And I think it builds on these two comments, but a little differently. Dehn paints or does lithographs or sketches the high and the mighty, and it's not an abstract glance that he gives them. There's a kind of sardonic comment. But when you look at his portraits of a Mexican man standing with the mountain behind him, here's his heroic portrait. Or if you look at his portrait of 2 Mayans, staggering presence of these heads on painting takes one over, takes one into repeated experiences of thinking about these people. And yet in both these cases, a Mexican, let's use the word peasant, just to be argumentative, and the Mayans who were on the edge of extermination and whose culture is marginalized in our world. These were heroic figures for him. So I think he does have a strong voice, and I think he does speak for certain kinds of social justice in his work.
I think that's very true, and of course he starts off with a very overtly leftist orientation. What's interesting is that the overt political statement becomes a little bit suppressed in his work, but I think there's this undercurrent which is maybe even more powerful and interesting, that this residue that remains. Yeah.
You know, Phil,
Charles.
your comment in the book as well about the fact that so many of this generation were just buried by art critics after the war, and I didn't, you know, the fact that they were so closely associated with either fascism or communism, to me, it's fascinating, and you just sort of wonder how that could have been had such a quick and profound effect and on, you know, the whole art world's taste. But
Let me tell you what it was like, because I've had the privilege to interview so many of these artists of this generation. I'll give you a kind of ground report of what happened. The most reliable index of the trending in American art was the annual, the Whitney Annual. The Whitney Annual was it was if the Olympics is the best performers every 4 years, the Whitney Annual will be when you look at who is in the rooms. And I remember Mr. Cadmus told me this, and Robert Vickery told me this. In the 1930s and 40s, you had a truly open dialogue of American art where you had the traditional realist and the academic artist, and then there were the modernists were very much part of what Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney and Lloyd Goodrich and the curators in the Whitney in the 30s and 40s, what they wanted. They wanted this real mix. By the late 40s, it became very clear that the new American painting, the new abstract, the large paintings were going to take over, and that by the late 50s, the realists were just shuttered off to one little room in the Whitney show, and they would go to these and they felt like they were at a wake. You know, they would look at each other and they'd say, well, you know, the whole parade has just passed us by. Dehn speaks about this in an interview in 1963 for the Archives of American Art. This was a tape recording, and Henry and I have gone through this transcript. And Dehn he's very proud of what his work is, and he's not going to apologize, and he's not going to waver. He says, "I've never cared for abstraction. I do what I do," and it was almost as though, to hell with, if the art world's not ready for my art, I'm not going to bend to it. And he paid a price. I've interviewed many of that generation, and I have to share with you, many of these, and for the most part, they were men. They were the top. They were the at the top of their game. These were the most written about, admired artists in New York in the 30s and 40s, and they were winning every national. They would win prizes at the Carnegie. There was always the big Carnegie exhibit, and they were being given all kinds of accolades as being America's top artist. by the 50s, they were nobodies. And there was a real, you had to feel the sense of rejection and disparagement, and how now these men were in their 70s and 80s when I was interviewing them, and they said, well, we don't understand. We were the top artist, and now we're in the trash heap of history. And it was very difficult for them to face that they were has-beens, and words that were used in the art press of that period. They are dinosaurs, they're sentimentalists, their art is just hokey, and that was a tremendous stigma. So that's pretty much part of this, this revival, this renaissance of trying to give, put back into the limelight some of these artists who really deserved another look. There's no conspiracy theory. It's not as though this mysterious art world works, that there are people in a room somewhere in Midtown Manhattan and decide all of once. I mean, it doesn't quite work like that, but if you ever have a couple of months, just sit in your public library and just go through the art magazines. Just take the art news or the art magazine. Read the magazines. Flip through the art magazines in the 30s. Just pick any year, 1937, and just go through 10. Then read 1947. Then read 1957, and then read. It is the best index of telling you how the trend has changed dramatically because of the power of the art press, and the art public is listening to the voices of the critics. It's like New York theater. We all know that the New York Times is too powerful. You can't just have a vibrant theater in Manhattan with only one newspaper, the New York Times, that matters. Some of us remember when there were 7 newspapers in New York City. I remember that.
Well, and of course, those things, I was just going to briefly interject. I think it's interesting, that was a period when cultural pundits were very powerful. And, you read the New York Times and then you know what artists you're supposed to like or not like, or
Right.
what books are great literature and which ones are not great literature. And I think that now we take a more open-minded view of that. Yeah.
Given that, Henry, do you think we could ever see this happen again? What happened to those artists post-World War II, now that we have so much more information, so many more sources? Could you ever see it happening again with a trend in art where all of a sudden something that we think is great today would be seen as...
Well, I think the art world has never been quite as strange as it is now. If you look at these $100 million paintings, and for that matter, the young artists who are selling their paintings for $10 or $15 million. I mean, I think that there's always been a fickleness to the art world, but everything seems to be bigger and faster than it was a generation ago.
The taking a pulse of the art world today has become so fragmented it's become so atomized that it's very similar in communication theory, and when media critics talk about that, we all, some of us in the room who are over 50 remember that we had that sense of a there when Walter Cronkite or when David Brinkley would deliver the news, and that was the news, and that was the news. And now we have, with the proliferation and on one hand it's so exciting. You have 1,000 art journals online, and you have 1,000, but the art world becomes a very untidy and very complicated of many streams and no centrality, and there's no rhyme or reason to it. I mean, the best example was you have a very important graffiti grunge painter in Jean-Michel Basquiat, the Basquiat story. He's a very important painter. He's a very important, of the tragic story, and he's in the Warhol studio, and he dies of a heroin overdose at age 27, and he leaves a couple of really great paintings. I mean, they're really good paintings, those big black skull paintings. Okay? last May, a painting of Basquiat came up at Sotheby's. It was, because there are so few of them, it was the original estimate was $60 million, which was already a fantastic sum of money, $60 million. It ended up, there was a kind of death spiral of these bidders went up, and then a Japanese collector, Mr. Murakami, bought it for $111 million. He bought this for $111 million. Almost simultaneously, a Leonardo da Vinci, the only Leonardo da Vinci painting that has been transacted in the last 100 years. There's never been a discovery of a Leonardo da Vinci that has been validated by scholars as an authentic Leonardo. This painting came on the market in London a few years ago, and it was sold recently. It was sold for, after it was cleaned and it was authenticated, it was sold for $75 million. Now, you want to take a grunge graffiti painting, or for 111, or do you want to have the only Leonardo da Vinci discovered in 100 years for $75 million? This is a complete madness. This is insanity.
Because there was a Pollock that sold for a little over $100 million, and to put that in perspective, if you earned the wage of the average American, it would take you 6,000 years to save up enough money to buy this painting. And that's assuming that you don't need to eat or pay rent, but are simply putting your entire income aside for this painting. So that, I mean, I do think that that's bizarre. And the one thing I would say is we live in a bizarre world. Think what the name Coca-Cola is worth. We live in a world where these imaginary things are worth unbelievable sums of money, or they're worth nothing at all if fashion changes.
Quick
Yeah.
question, what year did the Met acquire it?
1941.
Sorry, which one?
1941.
Right, so before he completely dropped off.
Yeah, he had just completed a Guggenheim Fellowship, and he was in his Annus Mirabilis was 1941. He had been featured in a major, he had a big color, 8-page color feature in Esquire magazine. He was then given this tremendous honor of being this big spread in Life magazine. And you all have to appreciate that in that era, to get that kind of window. There was a Saturday Evening Post cover artist, not Norman Rockwell, but the second greatest cover artist, a gentleman named Stephen Dohanos, the boy wonder from Lorain, Ohio. We call him the boy wonder, Mr. Dohanos, who ended up living in Westport, Connecticut. And I did his show at the New Britain Museum, and I did it. And I would sit with Mr. Dohanos in his 80s, and he was devastated that he was just a has-been. I mean, and he said to me, Philip, imagine, in an era before television, the only time the American public saw any kind of color or anything visual was when either the Time magazine or the Saturday Evening Post arrived in your mailbox out in County Road 29 out in Nebraska, and you pulled this color, you pulled this amazing magazine, and then when you had the cover of the Saturday Evening Post, he said it was the greatest window in America. I mean, it was that was it. That's when your fame was really at its peak. And that's really, you'll read, hopefully you'll see how I treat the pre-war Dehn and by the 50s he was struggling to survive, and some of the nicest works, I mean, there was a watercolor we had here. Let's see, I want to show you this. There's a watercolor that he did of the United Nations, and we had this in our exhibit. Oh, here it is. It's nice and large so you can see it. This is a painting done of the United Nations in 1954. Okay, it's a fantastic, and it's brand new. It's you can just see the international modern style. The building is so fresh. Harrison Associates have just built this. It's sitting there on Turtle Bay, and you'd say, wow, that's a great document of mid-century America. Truth be told, and Andy has this in one of the cardboard, in one of the boxes, this was the the May calendar page for the Middlesex Insurance Company of Massachusetts. This was a page in a calendar that Mr. Dehn probably received in 1954. He probably got $100, $200 for this as a, and this would be a fantastic painting now of mid-century America. So he just survived. He just survived. Yes.
I have a question for either of you, but perhaps more for Professor Adams from a biographical standpoint. I wonder if you could discuss, we haven't mentioned this at all, and it's not particularly relevant to the showdown in Fairfield or whatever, but whether you could discuss Dehn's attitude or attitudes towards religion. Because when I think about it, I think about all these very amusingly anti-clerical, I guess, especially. There's one called Little Christian, where this little girl is born. There's one with a pastor with the tail of the devil wrapped around him. There's like Immaculate Conception. There's all the nun things. There's so many of these things, and they're all very funny.
Yeah.
He was also equal opportunity. He did a whole number on rabbis also. He was an equal opportunity offender, yeah. Yeah.
I think a lot of that goes back to his childhood in Minnesota, where you basically had these preachers in different churches who were basically, giving sermons about how everyone else was going to go to hell, and you were probably going to go to hell if you didn't straighten up a little bit. So I think that's a good part of it. And then I think the whole thing of nuns is very interesting because, how would I say, Dehn is fascinated. He's an appreciator of women, and all his successive girlfriends were quite good looking and had long, beautiful legs. But he's also fascinated by the idea of what it would be to consecrate your life to chastity, and sort of what your awareness of sexual things is if you're a nun. One of his most memorable prints is of a bunch of nuns painting landscapes, and Pan is springing up in the pond. And do they see him or do they not see him?
Let me share, and Leslie, I know we're going to wrap up soon, but let me share what was the most challenging part in terms of writing this book for me is when I hit, and I had a lot of soul searching about this, and I had to really consult with almost an ethicist on this issue, and I had to check in with my colleagues. You all have to, you'll read this, and some of you know this already, but Adolf Dehn was really one of the key white artists in Harlem in the 30s. Harlem in the 30s was essentially a place where it was very exploitive. The clubs, the famous clubs, the Cotton Club, the Savoy Ballroom, were basically white clubs, and black people were not allowed even to be on the dance floor. And he was very, very sympathetic, and because of his left-wing and socialist and his human social justice intuition, he knew this was terrible. When you do get to read this chapter, and here's a map of Harlem in the 30s, the most difficult part that I had was the contextualizing the issue of the depiction, these gross stereotypes. This was your question, sir, about caricature and satire. That once you cross the boundary into satire, you have to understand that how the American public dealt with Negroes in America. Think about how explosive Al Jolson in blackface in The Jazz Singer was, which was really actually very sympathetic to black Americans, even though if you read film historians, imagine how daring he is, the miscegenation here of white women, elderly doyens dancing with black dancers here, and some of the caricature, caricature of black musicians and dancers here, it gets to be very, very daring. I think this is in this page. You begin to see he's using caricature And it's a difficult conversation. It's a very difficult conversation because you can't rewind the videotape. There's an edition of George Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, and it's he talks in the Rhapsody in Blue. Gershwin talks about the meld of Caribbean and African and music from the and the cover illustration of this, which was printed in 1930-31, is you would see it and you would think it would be the most outrageously offensive imagery of Negroes in that period. And this is Gershwin, who's actually trying to teach white America about the black influence. And so when you look at that section of the book about Harlem, read along with the wrestling, the conflicts I had in putting this in context and to writing it with sensitivity, understanding the language that is appropriate in the academy today. And there again, we cannot run the videotape backwards. You can't undo history. These were perceptions. Must look at the perceptions of black Americans in Gone with the Wind or even a racist, trope like King Kong. We can't stand outside of that. It was racist stereotyping. Dehn, 100%, his credentials are impeccable. He is a social justice activist. He supports the first integrated jazz club in New York called Cafe Society. He painted the mural on Sheridan Square of a jazz club called Cafe Society, and his best friend was a Jewish communist named Barney Josephson, who was in front of the House of Un-American Activities Committee. So Dehn's credentials as being for black Americans those are impeccable credentials, but a black person looking at these images today will say, what was going on in this man's head? And that's the conflict you have to ride along with. Leslie?
I'm coming. I didn't want to interrupt. And just to add to that, we started this project 3 years ago, and there were a couple of points historically along the way where Philip did get a little concerned about the content of the book and how it was going to be represented, and we talked about that a fair amount, and I hope you think I encouraged you to just put it in there. Just put it in there. It's important.
Contextualize it. Contextualize it.
I was just going to say that we put it in context, that we offer it up as part of the overall presentation of this particular artist's life and work and his commitment. And the information that he brought back from Europe and the way it was presented there, that the satirical aspect of sharing this thought process, this social connection, was something they had been doing for centuries, or certainly for generations, and it was something that I felt was looking to introduce that here in a way that we would start to understand the imbalance of what was going on. And I'm very encouraged by what you said to Tula, that students are looking at this now, because if I'm talking to some of the dealers in New York or other artists, they're very discouraged by what's going on in the art world at the moment, and it's important that we have this opportunity now to celebrate, to raise up an artist who had that overview of not only our society but of the art world, and has relevance today in a way that may speak to a lot more of us and to a new generation of scholars and students who will appreciate that it will resonate for them in a way that I hope will allow them to take it forward in some form of their own. So anyway, sorry.
I'd like to just throw in a couple of quick comments. First of all, I wanted to give a plug for something I've recently written. Thomas Hart Benton's mural in Indiana, the classroom where it's on view, has recently been sort of sealed off because it contains a representation of the Ku Klux Klan. And basically, Benton put that in as an anti-Klan statement. But anyway, I've written a piece in a website called The Conversation, and if you look up Henry Adamson, The Conversation, and Benton, if you Google that, I think it's going to appear next Monday, but anyway, sometime next week. But that touches on some of the things we've written, we've been discussing. Just to wrap this up, I think that figures like Dehn are fascinating in the way they bring us back into another period, but also in terms of paintings of New York, I guess I'd say that I think that Dehn captured the romantic beauty of New York in a way that no other artist did. And I'm just looking at the back wall, but these are romantic paintings with a little bit the quality of a Whistler Nocturne. I mean, I think that he's a very varied and versatile artist, and Philip has done a great job of capturing qualities in Dehn that have never been written about before. So,
Thank you. No,
yeah.
important. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed our event this afternoon and meeting amazing historians and just nice guys to hang out with. Please enjoy. We have some cider and donuts, and just don't feel like you have to rush off. Enjoy the art if you haven't had a chance, and delighted you could all be here today. Thank you.
When you look at those paintings, particularly the large views of the city from the river, just remember F. Scott Fitzgerald said, looking at Manhattan from the 59th Street Bridge is greater than all the beauty in the world.